Thank you, Thomas. And I think I must honestly say to you, you're a brave man to say that we should look at Romans, not Vikings, in this house. I would have been more careful, probably. No, really nice. Thank you for your contribution. I think it gave some great insight as to how your business can support these global developments. Our next speaker is Tim Noonan, and I hope I pronounced this well. Tim, welcome. Tim is the managing director of Cargill. Tim has a background in private equity for a long period of time, and from that perspective must have seen lots of businesses and enterprises and value chains develop. So very interesting to hear your perspective from the perspective of the company Cargill, which is also a proud sponsor of NASF. So thank you for being here and joining us today.
Thanks, John. Good afternoon. I know I have the unenviable task of standing between you and lunch, so I'll try to keep your attention as long as possible. I want to take a few minutes to double click, particularly into the role of the consumer moving forward, double click into Renata's earlier comments on that consumer, with a particular focus on the US. You in the room here are likely to be part of either Gen X or the millennial generation. You're somewhere between the ages of 23 and 55. And in the United States, those two generations consume primarily shrimp and salmon. About 40 to 50% of what we consume is in those two species from a seafood standpoint. Going forward, we expect that those two generations are going to significantly change how the consumption of seafood takes place in that market, and we expect similar trends to evolve in other markets, both developed and developing going forward. In the US, for example, smoked and prepared seafood, particularly in salmon fillets, pre-cooked products, whether they be shrimp or salmon, are largely consumed by that older demographic, that Generation X. The younger demographic is increasingly interested in additional value added, more varieties of prepared food. They're more likely to buy all different types of prepared shrimp, and in particular, they're more likely to be less price conscious, more focused, as Renata alluded to, on sustainability in developed markets, and more focused on seafood with a safety story in developing markets like China. What you may not know is that Gen X and millennials, while they currently have the purchasing power because they earn the income, they're heavily influenced by the next generation, by your children, which we would call Generation Z. This year, 40% of total consumption in the United States will be driven by that Generation Z. And 70% of family food choices will be driven by that Generation Z. So you can tell yourself the next time you go into a supermarket that you're the one with the money in your pocket and you're the one making the decision, but I guarantee you it's your children who have decided for you. Now, you may not know too much about Cargill. We're not a household name, but we are America's largest privately held family-owned company, and we're one of the largest privately held companies in the world. We have about 160,000 employees operating in 70 countries around the world. For more than 150 years, we've prided ourselves on trying to nourish the world in a safe, responsible, and sustainable way. Today, we serve all of these customers and thousands more. We put food on the plates of more than 2 billion people each day. In protein production alone, we're the largest processor of ground beef globally. We're the second largest fed beef processor in North America, second largest producer of eggs in North America, a leading producer of chicken in China, in the rest of Asia, in much of Latin America, and the largest processor of fresh whole turkeys. You may also know us as an important feed supplier here in the aqua industry. Let's talk a little bit about where demand is coming from. So today, we see demand rising as incomes rise, and there will be a continued trend towards urbanization. About 56% of the world is urbanized today. That'll grow to about 60% by 2030. That urbanization and that rising income result in an increase in animal protein consumption. That's that blue bar towards the top. There's a particular spike at about $3,000 of income per capita. So you'll see that curve turn almost vertical at $3,000. And that accelerates all the way down the curve with a particular continuation at around $35,000 of income, where grain-based foods dips below animal protein consumption. Now, this is interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, we expect it will continue. So despite what you may read in the media, the demand for animal protein is still rising. And the demand is still rising even in developed economies like the United States. Now that demand is changing, yes, that's to be sure. And we're going to talk for a minute about where we see those changes occurring within animal protein. On the left-hand side here, you'll see that on average, there is about 1.6% compounded annual growth in animal protein over the next 5 years. Seafood is already the largest of the protein categories, more metric tons of seafood consumed than any other protein. But that growth is slightly slower than the growth of poultry. And yet, because of its size, seafood will contribute more to the growth of global animal protein than any other protein. And seafood and poultry together will account for about 70% of the total growth in animal protein consumption. Now, how will that evolution look over the next 5 or 10 years? Well, interestingly, we asked in a series of surveys to US consumers, how will you eat protein differently in the future? When you plan a meal, what do you start with today? And you'll see along the bottom here, the Gen Z, that youngest generation, thinks differently about how to start the preparation of a meal. They'll begin with a number of other thoughts and then finally result at what's going to be in the center of the plate. It used to be that boomers, and still is the case, that boomers would plan the meal around the center of the plate protein. That's a big change. Consumers are looking for flexibility, and we think at Cargill we can provide them with some of the choices, some of the options that they will need as they think about the construct of that meal moving forward. Now, it's true that 50% or almost 50% of those same consumers are looking to increase the amount of protein that they want in their diet. Another 10% are trying not to decrease, so almost 60% either want to maintain or increase the amount of protein that they're eating. And 17%, only 17% are not focused on managing protein in their diet today. We also did a global survey in every continent other than Antarctica and Africa. And we asked consumers to tell us how they expected to see the evolution of their protein consumption going forward. 70% of those consumers intend to increase their consumption in the next year. Interestingly, 83% of those respondents also expressed an interest in alternative proteins. So these consumers are not eating only animal protein or only plant-based protein. They're eating a combination of the two. That future of alternative proteins will also look different. It will probably comprise a basket of alternatives. One of those baskets is plant-based. We know this is increasingly important to certain populations and certain age groups. We know it needs to be part of an overall offering of animal protein and alternative protein products. You're well aware of the mainstream media and all the discussion about Impossible Foods and Beyond Meats. We're a supplier to both of those businesses, but we also have our own range of plant-based products. And we expect that this category will continue to grow off of a very small base at extremely impressive growth rates. In the middle column, cell-based products. These are products that are not yet commercially available. They're not yet commercially viable. But they are interesting products because they use the actual underlying cells of the meat or the seafood, and they produce through fermentation or 3D printing or other technologies to achieve a product form that looks and tastes almost exactly as the traditional product. And then there are novel ingredients, insects, single-cell bacteria, algae, and other proteins that we expect will at some point become part of the human diet in addition to their current position as important ingredients, new but important ingredients in the feed that goes into animal proteins. If you had to boil all of this down, consumers are looking for three key elements. They're looking for a product portfolio that gives them diversity in their diet. They want to tell a story to themselves that they feel good about, a story that they believe they can share with their children and their grandchildren that is not making the planet a more uninhabitable place for those next generations. But they want choice. They want to see in the supermarket or in the food service channel a range of options at different price points, at different quality levels, and obviously in these different species. Secondly, they're looking for that story to tell them what's happening to the underlying thing that they're eating. So where did it come from? How traceable was it? How sustainable was it? What happened to the animals in that supply chain? And increasingly, as you've heard today, we're using technology to tell that story differently. Cargill's been recognized by Forbes magazine recently as one of the top 50 global players working on a traceability solution or set of solutions, leveraging blockchain and other means to tell that story differently. And then there are these health values, right? We sometimes conflate them because we believe as consumers that elements of sustainability or elements of animal welfare are also impacting the health of the product that we're eating. And that's an important characteristic of a consumer choice today. So we know that omega-3s are found in seafood, but we're not hearing consumers say that they're choosing seafood because of those omega-3s. Or we're not hearing often enough that they're combining the thought of those omega-3s with an understanding of the sustainable footprint of the seafood that they're consuming. And they're certainly not seeing affordability in that seafood because we're seeing huge price volatility in the supermarket. So we have to bring a portfolio of these attributes together. We have to bring affordability with nutrition, with sustainability, to be able to offer that consumer exactly what they want, where they want it, when they want it. Now, as a food and ag integrated player, we think there are some lessons from agriculture that can be applied here to the seafood space. We know that in agriculture, the first thing that's required is an efficient value chain, a value chain that is transparent, a value chain that delivers product on time, in full, consistently, with reliable supply and quality baked into that product. What's in the bag must be on the bag, and vice versa. And too often, we're not finding that in the seafood value chain. Our data suggests that between 20 and 30% of the seafood that's consumed in the United States is mislabeled. And it's mislabeled not accidentally, or it appears not to be accidental. It's always the case that the mislabeling results in something that causes the consumer to pay more for something that is worth less. So we know there's a huge opportunity here to take some lessons from the way sophisticated ag commodity value chains have evolved and apply them to the much more fragmented, much more nascent seafood supply chains that we see today. Secondly, we understand that in large-scale agriculture, one company can't do it all. There is a need for partnerships. There's a need to recognize that you have some core competencies, some comparative advantages. and you should play to those strengths. And we or others will have other comparative advantages, and we should play to those strengths. And if we work together, we will accomplish more to build these value chains than if we go it alone. So we think there's something there about partnership that has not always been the case in the seafood industry. And third, in the agriculture space, we see huge benefits from economies of scale. Those partnerships, when they work well, they create large supply chains and they make the complex simpler. It's still the case in the shrimp industry that product may move from Ecuador, where it's farmed, to Vietnam, where it's processed, and back to the United States, where it's consumed. That greenhouse gas footprint is not a good one. And it's also very difficult to tell the story of that seafood because there's so many handoffs, so many middlemen along the way, so many fingers in the till, that it's not good from a food safety standpoint. It's also diffusing margin and making it more difficult for companies to step forward with innovative solutions to pay for that innovation because it's so fragmented. So we believe that there's something here we can apply from agriculture as well to create those economies of scale based on those partnerships, working together to get that transparent, very efficient food supply chain system in place. What does that mean for us in the seafood industry? Well, you've seen that seafood is the largest of the animal proteins. It is the species that will contribute most to the animal protein growth moving forward. Culturally, it's more preferred than any other protein in our portfolio globally. It will increasingly be farmed, and when it isn't farmed, it will be responsibly caught. And you've heard from Tesco today, we see it in all the conversations we have with retailers and e-commerce operators. We see the importance of both farmed and responsibly caught seafood in a portfolio. It will increasingly, as Renata said, need to be part of a portfolio that includes plant-based, not at the exclusion of one, but selling the attributes of seafood is really important. And those attributes are more than those omega-3s. We have to deliver a system that is affordable, that can predict price, that's demonstrably better in quality than it is today, that is more transparent and more sustainable. We know that demand will exceed supply. You all in the salmon industry see that and have seen that for several years now. The unintended consequence of that is that price has risen significantly, and that has shrunk the available addressable market in a number of geographies around the world. We must unlock more supply, largely through innovation, in order to be able to better manage and ultimately lower the price point of seafood. And if we do that, we'll be surprised by the number of consumers that choose seafood, knowing the story that they can now tell to that next generation. In China, we expect that in the next 5 years, about 12% of the world's supply of salmon will go to that market. That's a 3x increase from today. In the US, where the average consumer eats 2.7 ounces of seafood today per week, against a guideline nationally of almost 3 times that. And where that consumption of seafood, if you think about Giles' comments earlier, is about 40% of what the UK consumes today. His comment was the UK has a long way to go. So imagine we have a 2.5x opportunity to get the US to where the UK is, and then a huge opportunity to move the UK and the US to where the rest of the world is. As a global seafood company, as a global industry, and as a global protein company, we're committed to an inclusive set of options that bring the consumer together with a portfolio that meets them where they are and evolves with them as they move forward. We believe the future will look very different. I suspect most of you agree with that. It will be more complex in some ways, and hopefully it will be more simple in other ways. Certainly it will be easier if we go it together than if we go it alone. And so we look forward to working with you to create that future together. Thank you very much.
Tim, thank you very much. Again, very inspiring and some staggering numbers if you just calculate the huge potential Tim was describing in terms of future potential growth. Thank you again. This closes the Leaders Perspective seminar for this part with one important topic to go. But before going there, I would like to thank the speakers one more time for their fantastic contribution. So Jill, Noel, Renate, Thomas and Tim, thank you for that. It's always an effort to prepare yourselves, but I think you've given us a fantastic insight into how consumers can drive change. And the young generation is actually becoming an important part of that change. And a fair reflection without without being briefed in this perspective. Everyone just simply talks about sustainability. And if I go back 10 years in time, I mean, these lectures really look different today. So there was a good coherence between the topics. It really shows that collaboration is necessary and that seafood can be part of that solution and that there is huge potential to tap into if we do indeed work together on changing those habits. So on that point, I'd like to close with a statement that Thomas made. I do agree. It's more about planet ocean than